I'd like to call upon two of our engineering physics students, Shiny Brar, a fourth-year EP student from our department, and Amy Pittman, a graduate student also in our department and who also did her undergrad degree with us in engineering physics. And they're going to tell you a little bit about the career and background of our distinguished speaker, Dr. Charles Till. So please join me in welcoming Shiny Brar and Amy Pittman to the podium.
An internationally renowned nuclear engineer, Dr. Charles Till has been responsible for research and development affecting nuclear power worldwide. A fellow of the American Nuclear Society, he was awarded their Walker-Seisler Medal for his work in developing fast reactor technology. A graduate of the U of S here, we welcome him home tonight as the 2014 C.J. MacKenzie Distinguished Lecturer.
Dr. Till got his Bachelor's of Science in Engineering Physics way back in 1956, and then he went on to get his Master's in 1958. At this point, he got the Athlon Fellowship. It's a fellowship given to top Canadian engineering graduates. It gave him a chance to go to England and study there further.
Using the Athlon Fellowship, he left his home province of Saskatchewan to pursue a PhD in mechanical engineering at Imperial College London. He graduated from this degree in 1960 with a specialty in reactor physics. Then, at the age of 28, he returned to Canada to start work on the first Canadian power reactors.
During all this time, he also did an MBA in 1976 from University of Chicago. His technical skills and his management skills were vital when he led a team of over 2,000 scientists, engineers, and students and support staff. He worked for over 10 years at the Argonne facilities, the main lab in Illinois, and the reactor facilities in Idaho.
Some of the early reactor concepts that Dr. Till worked on included the UK gas-cooled reactor, the Canadian heavy water reactor, which most of you probably know as the CANDU reactor, and the US light water reactor. In 1963, he was hired by Argonne National Laboratory as an assistant physicist. 10 years later, in 1973, he became the director of the reactor physics division, and then finally was promoted to become the director of the Argonne Reactor Development Program in 1980.
Dr. Till led this program for 17 of his most innovative and productive years. His career has been illustrious and inspiring. He is the pioneer in nuclear physics. So at this point, I would like everybody to join Amy and me in welcoming our 2014 C.J. MacKenzie Lecturer, Dr. Charles Till.
Well, I just related a comment of Hans Beta's to my table mates here. After a particularly generous introduction, as I received a moment ago, that very distinguished Nobel laureate said, "Thank you, I believe 50% of it." Honorable members, President, fellow guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored, of course, to be with you. I am very much aware of the quality of engineers from the College of Engineering here at Saskatchewan. They, after all, were my colleagues, and almost without exception, unusually good people. I've got a great respect for the College of Engineering here. It is an honor to be this year's recipient of the Distinguished Graduate recognition. It has, I'm sure will not come as a surprise to you, great meaning for me. I will use my time with you tonight to tell you the story how the University of Saskatchewan and this College of Engineering provided the springboard for a wonderfully interesting and varied life. As the distinguished old senator from the great state of Louisiana, Russell Long, once remarked in my presence, when asked how he had risen from as a first-year senator to become the powerful chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. Why, he said, I just watched very carefully. And he said, I learned from the older men. Well, so did I. And one step followed another. Successes, disappointments, obviously, but in seeking to achieve, it was a life deeply interesting, rewarding, and often simply exciting. Its foundations were all here at the College of Engineering at the University of Saskatchewan, and I want every one of the students here tonight to listen to what I have to say. I mean, the things I'm describing, given the background that you will get here at Saskatchewan, all of the things I'm describing are perfectly possible. It seems like a long road ahead of you, but you're taking one step at a time, and some pretty amazing things are possible. I should say right off that most of what I say tonight leads to the 10 years at the apex of my career, when the initiation of a huge reactor project at a great national laboratory was my goal, and as it became possible and began to succeed, my responsibility. It was in a political atmosphere that was poisonous to nuclear, and the interplay of technical fact, and by that I mean proven technical fact, and politics at a high level, and societal concerns provided the impetus for that whole project, with characteristics finally proven that were undreamed of, were not thought possible when we began. Now, a noted speaker once wrote that people are interested in people. So don't talk about things, talk about people. And tonight I will talk a little bit about a few of the people here at the University of Saskatchewan at my time who were my earliest and most powerful influences, and whose timely help set me on a path to everything that came later. Now, I hasten to say that I am familiar with the regrettable human tendency to overemphasize one's own accomplishments. I once listened to a baseball player who was asked to assess the importance of a baseball game that he had won. And he said, and I quote, "It was a victory for the forces of light over the powers of darkness." As you will agree, I think this is almost certainly an overstatement. I've been lucky in living the life I've had, a life in full, someone once wrote, and to use, well, to me it was a glorious adventure of opportunity, experiences, excitements, distinguished colleagues, notables from many fields. I was lucky in working on important things and lucky at being at the right place at the right time. But I do keep in mind my baseball player. It's not the powers of the universe that I'm going to be talking about tonight. It's just the life made possible by the College of Engineering for a small town boy from the north of Saskatchewan. I hope you'll find it interesting, but there's a lesson here. A first-rate engineering college like this one, thoughtful of and helpful to its students, and with some luck, too, will give those students the knowledge and, very importantly, the confidence to do some pretty amazing things. Now, my story starts in the small town of Aylsham. My father had an English private school education. My mother was a teacher of English and later head of the mathematics department in the big district, large school unit. So an education was pressed upon me very early. It came early to me, as I said, but so did mischief. And so I was, just after my 5th birthday, I was implanted in the 1st grade, getting me out from underfoot. I graduated then on my 17th birthday and promptly went to work in the John Deere agency. I had absolutely no thought of college, none. Back then, nobody went to college. Well, nobody from my small town. But the next fall, when walking over the crops with my dad, I was trying to convince him to buy a new car. And he said, well, the crops look pretty good, Charles. Which would you rather have, car or college? Well, college meant one thing to me, fun. And more fun. So, I registered in engineering because that's what I thought boys did. I had no idea what an engineer did. It was only after my 1st year that it came to me that it was quite possible to calculate how things were going to behave, and that I actually could do the calculations. Now, I stuck this in here to show my, as a Renaissance man who had many, many interests, the exact moment when, as in Winnie the Pooh, for those of you old enough to remember that fine A.A. Milne book, Winnie the Pooh and Piglet, I dropped a wood block off a bridge, timed its fall, and calculated how high the bridge was. Well, after that, I calculated pretty much everything, everywhere and everything. The next summer at the zinc plant at Hudson Bay Mining and Smelting in Flin Flon, I earned enough to put myself through my 2nd year, and in line registering, I found myself facing Owen Mann, Professor Owen Mann, who I'm sure many of you in this room remember with fondness. He knew a little bit about Flin Flon, so he chatted with me back and forth a little bit, and then he said, Chuck, are you going into engineering physics? And I didn't know what to say. He said, well, it requires the highest marks, but if you're going to choose it, and then he said, your marks are lots good enough, but if you're going to choose it, you're going to have to decide right now, because you get added physics classes, added math classes. So I thought, well, if it requires the highest marks, it's probably the best. So I said, sure, okay, that's fine. And that set my whole career with just as little thought as that. It's astonishing how little thought you give actually to the biggest decisions in your life, including that of your mate. How little thought. It just, you happen to be at the right place at the right time in many instances. Then in my 3rd year, my good friend Ian Thorson, who had interviewed for a summer job with that very fine research engineer Gus Handegord at the National Research Council across from the engineering building then. I should do the same, he said. This was the first I'd heard of Gus. And as we shall see, and he and his friends, the engineering profs, all his age roughly, in their 30s then, became the major formative force of my professional life. Gus Handegord was the very model of an engineer. Unmistakable integrity, enthusiastic about new knowledge, talented, disciplined, humorous, and gentlemanly. I, like Russell Long, I tried to be like him. Winding up my interview, Gus asked me a final question. He said, if it was up to you, Chuck, who would you choose between yourself and Ian? And when I answered, well, Ian, of course, he's the brightest guy in our class. And Gus said, well, okay, Chuck, thanks for coming over. And I thought, that's that. Well, that response turned out to be fateful because Gus told me later it was because of those few words I'd said then that he had decided to ask Ottawa for approval to hire us both. And so he did. And at the end of summer, he offered me a job with him after graduation. And fatefully also, he made arrangements with Professor Balfour Curry, head of the physics department then, to allow me to take a master's degree with time at the university just counted as time on the job. So now I had a job after graduation, and not only that, I was getting a thorough grounding in engineering research techniques, goals, and importantly, I think, in attitudes from Gus and his colleagues. After a year or so, Curry put me in a room alone, handed me a bulky exam paper, and said he'd be back in a few hours. It was difficult. I worked my way through it, though, and it turned out that he'd had the first page of the Canadian Institute of Physics prize exam that year. He'd had the front page taken off, retyped to get rid of the identity of it, restapled it to the body of the exam, and tried it out on me. Well, you know, there was merriment among the staff about this. And I was somewhat less amused. But it turned out I'd done well enough. He gave my career 2 tremendous boosts just a short time later. And that's really the point of telling the story, that fine man made a complete difference in what I was able to do then later on. When the British Athlone Fellowships representative, Mr. Pomby, arrived that summer, the Board of Selection included 2 very influential voices, Balfour Curry and Gus Handegard. Not surprisingly, I was selected. But more than that, under arrangements made by Gus and his colleagues in engineering with Arthur Porter at Imperial College, I believe that Porter was to come to Saskatchewan as Dean of Engineering later that year. I asked for and was granted 2 years at Imperial College, University of London. Imperial had been chosen by the UK government to be supported as Britain's MIT. And even today, it's among the top 10, generally speaking, in the top engineering schools in the world in the lists that you see occasionally. It was a remarkable place in its way. It was, as I said earlier to someone, certainly not the dreamy spires of Oxford. This was a college that was crammed into a red brick or yellow brick, crammed into a city block in the busy London district of South Kensington. But it had a fine reputation and included several Nobel laureates. Now, at this time, 1958, nuclear power was the exciting new technology of the times. It's sort of the IT of that time. And Imperial was one of the few colleges in the world that had already instituted a nuclear power engineering specialty. And so I chose the nuclear engineering specialty because it was, as I said, largely the popular thing. The specialty was in the newspapers and so on at the time. The head of the nuclear power group, Professor J.M.K., was a remarkable man. He had led the investigation into the fire and the release of radioactivity at one of the plutonium production reactors at Windscale in the north of England a couple of years earlier and was given deference at the college, due deference. Now, graduate students, this I think for, again, you students, and perhaps for others, graduate student custom there was not like anything I'd seen before. You had access to any number of courses, but you didn't have to take any of them. You chose yourself what you thought would be useful. And you were assessed as you went along. Your thesis work fundamentally was what mattered. And if you were found by the powers that be to be, as the English said then, a good man, doors opened. Everything was open to you. The professors, everything was open to you. If not, it was a pretty lonely place. So I was pretty much aware of this, and the whole idea of it just suited me perfectly. And so when I went to see the professor, as Professor K was called by everyone, to the professor, to start a PhD program, he looked at me evenly and he said, "Ah, yes, Till, and what do you propose to write on?" And before I could answer, he went right on and he said, "Well, I suggest you go to the library and read on your subject. And when you decide, go back and see Jeffrey James," one of the professors. And then, smiling his wintry smile, he said, "And keep at him." And so I did. Good enough, I thought. My experiments and measurements went well. And after a bit, I thought about developing theory to generalize them. And one day it came to me how to frame the mathematics. And on that night I sat down and I got it done. Once the equations were stated properly, the logic of it all just flowed. It needed some approximations to reduce it to numbers, but without question it was right. And it was published in the venerable Journal of the Royal Society at the college a year or two later. With that, I was accepted as that elusive personage, a good man. And the way that was displayed was that while other graduate students studied together in a bullpen, I was promoted to a tiny office of my own. And it was unquestionably private. And I had unlimited access to the professorial staff, who cheerfully allowed me to argue with them. And, you know, it was just a great period in my life. And more than that, Professor K promised that when I wrote up my work, he would set my PhD oral exam the day the mandatory 2-year requirement was up. My exam took 40 minutes, and I graduated in 2 years. Apparently, it had not been done before, and that fact turned out to be a springboard, again, for much that came later. Imperial College finished a process, started at Saskatchewan, that gave me that invaluable gift, scientific confidence. The confidence to think about something. This doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense to me, it doesn't make sense. It's hard to overestimate how important that kind of confidence is. And the two colleges were what largely gave me that confidence to move to things that really were quite important later on. Of course, as I said to my wife, it helps to be right occasionally as well. I flew back to Canada just before Christmas in 1960. Professor Curry greeted me, chuckled with approval at the 2-year time, and after a few moments he said a former student of his was in charge of engineering at Canadian General Electric in Ontario, where they were constructing NPD, the first pilot plant for the CANDU reactors that followed. And with me sitting there, he called Les Haywood there, and in a few minutes of conversation where Curry was very generously described me, I was hired just like that. And once again, I'd been given a huge boost by this fine man. I got to Peterborough, and I was immediately given responsibility for preparing the startup of NPD and of carrying out the physics measurements, and as time went by, the sole responsibility of starting it up. I'd never been in the control room of a nuclear reactor. Nobody asked me for information as to what my experience was with reactors, and I didn't volunteer any. But really, it was the mark of the field at the time. It was new, and for a fresh PhD to be given that kind of responsibility. But I do think that it was the kind of thing that was expected at that time, more or less as a matter of course. In the event, the startup went smoothly enough, and I wrote up the measurements and published them, and that was that. Ontario Hydro took over operation of the reactor. There were no new reactors on the horizon at that point in Canada. I'd spent 2 years again, and I'd learned a lot. I'd now been in the control of an operating reactor, one that I'd started, and I looked around for more exciting opportunities. Exactly what I hoped for came immediately. Argonne National Laboratory, the premier non-military nuclear research R&D lab in the U.S., in the world really, asked me to come down to Chicago and interview. I knew how good argon was. In Britain, argon reports were read avidly, and at Imperial College, a thick one. Well, even at the UKAEA, which I spent my summers there working up there in the Lake Country, one thick one on reactor calculations in particular was an argon report referred to as the Bible. And all arguments about how calculations should be done were settled by the Bible. One of my interviewers, looking at my resume, commented again on that 2-year PhD and said he thought they'd be interested in me. Asked me what salary I would think fair, smiled at my response, passed me on to the next man. When I flew back home, a telegram awaited me, offering me at a job generously above my own suggestion. I was 28 years old. I was about to work at the laboratory at the pinnacle of nuclear development. I had a lot more to learn, but I was getting increasingly sure of myself, technically, and I was truly excited about the possibilities. Argonne in the spring of 1963 was a thoroughly, imposingly active nuclear laboratory. It was the first of the great national laboratories charged with nuclear development, civilian nuclear development, as it was called at the time. It was a little over 16 years old in that spring, had a very highly regarded staff, men who had built reactors of all kinds. Something like 50 reactors were built by Argonne in the 50s on the Idaho site, the Argonne, Idaho site. And men who had written the papers that I had read, well, really everyone in the business all around the world had read, including the Russians, I might say. Their first reactor was a direct copy of an earlier Argonne reactor. There'd been a Soviet spy at Argonne in those early days. Much later, I spoke with Oleg Kalugin, the ex-head of counter-espionage for the KGB, and who confirmed it and named the fellow. Kalugin, in a way, was one of those notable personalities that I mentioned earlier that I had met in my varied career. He was a memorable man. The activity at Argonne was constant and very professional. 4 new research reactors were in design, 2 of them actually under construction when I got there, 1 for civilian power and 1 for the space program. A big fast reactor producing electricity, EBR-2, experimental breeder reactor number 2, was in the startup phase on Argonne's remote site in the Idaho desert. Other experimental reactors were in operation at both Argonne sites. Every element of nuclear development was being pursued, and every element had a good man in charge of it. The monthly progress reports were an absolute joy to read. I joined right in. The important action seemed to be on the fast breeder reactor. And there, the reactivity effect, most important to safety, the Doppler effect, had not been well established, and I was asked if I could improve the situation, and I said I thought I could. I had given it a little bit of thought earlier, and I was given 2 very competent helpers. And in the summer of 1965, we completed a real wide range of measurements, very accurately pinning down those effects. And that program was the basis for my election to the National Academy of Engineering a few years later. I vividly remember driving home from work one evening, and I was thinking precisely this: I'm doing exactly what I'm trained to do. I'm given all the help and all the equipment I need. The work is important, and it's on things that have never been done before. And I'm paid very, very well. It's like a minor aristocracy. What a life this is. By the early 70s, I had been made director of the reactor physics division. I was directing the work of something over 100 physicists, engineers, and supporting staff. And I'd become a U.S. citizen by that time. I knew that Argonne was likely to be where my career was going to be. And with this promotion, I had very real responsibilities. And really, what I wanted was to start to form a nucleus of people within that one division for the big reactor development program that actually did come later in the mid-1980s. But of course, I couldn't predict it then. Because I was in charge of the top reactor physics capability in the nation now, the Atomic Energy Commission, which is the governmental body at the time for nuclear, appointed me U.S. technical member at the Nuclear Energy Agency, on the Nuclear Energy Agency Committee on Reactor Physics, which was centered in Paris. The committee met for a week each year, and in various nations. You went from the nations where you had one representative on the committee to another on the committee, and so on. And occasionally even met in Paris. The members were at the top of their nation's programs. Some, though, were young and on their way up, and some were very mature, wise men. I enjoyed the give and take, and I quickly made friends. And in 1977, this brought quite an unexpected interlude. Accompanying the State Department diplomats as their technical advisor, as well as a group of anti-nuclear non-proliferation administration people on every one of these trips to the various nations, while in particular the diplomats pursued the nuclear negotiations set in motion by the new U.S. administration. Phil Farley, who I didn't know then but came to know later, came out of retirement to guide the diplomatic effort. Farley had been the leading diplomat in all kinds of U.S. negotiations going all the way back to World War II. He was a very senior man. The new U.S. policy didn't seem wise to me at all, but it concerned mainly chemistry, and I thought as a physicist I wouldn't have much contact with it. But a week or so later, I got a phone call from Farley. He immediately asked me to join the diplomatic effort. I was surprised. I was speechless, really. Before I could say anything, he took over. Chuck, he said, I've made a few inquiries, and I know you don't agree with the directions our nation is taking on this. But we need you. You know these guys, the leaders of the programs of the other nations, and we don't. We can't go to them with a bunch of bureaucrats. They won't listen. He said, I need you to explain to our international colleagues what our nation's policy is, and that you be there with us. Please understand, I'm not asking you to say anything that you don't believe yourself. But in explaining your position, he said, I want no more than that. I've been in that position many times when I didn't believe in the wisdom of a policy, but I explained it as well as I could, and I'm just asking you to do the same. Well, I spent 2 years with those people, And it was true. Many of the leaders were friends I'd made from that committee. And I learned a lot. I learned about a lot about the workings of other nations, about international politics, and about the muddle much of it is. A humorous example, in Moscow, on the last day of one of our meetings, our diplomats haggled at length over wording in the communique that was supposed to summarize the agreements of the meeting. At length, long into lunch hour, the success was achieved, and the Soviet leader bore this single sheet of paper triumphantly away to get it formally typed up. After a very long wait, he returned. Obviously shamed, he said very weakly, "It's Friday afternoon. The secretaries have all gone home. There's nothing can be done." Well, of course, what we did was liberate one of the typewriters and typed it up ourselves, but still, this struck me as unusual, if not totally humorous. But anyway, that whole episode gave me confidence in things that were a long way from engineering practice. But again, we're all based entirely on my engineering education. Now, in 1980, the very technology of nuclear plants were under attack, as many of you know. The characteristics that everyone thought, or at least we all thought, were well enough in hand: safety, waste, non-proliferation, for example, were being called into account by opponents as reasons to block further progress. I'd seen a lot of these professional anti-nukes. I traveled with them, I dined with them, I drank with them, I knew them. I felt they should be taken on directly. If they were sincere in what they said, then better technology, superior technology, should neutralize their claims. Now, by this time, or at this time, again, I was head of reactor physics, and that's kind of a central discipline, as you would guess, in nuclear, for those of you not particularly familiar with it. And my colleagues in other disciplines, chemistry, metallurgy, etc., had taken to dropping in on me from time to keep me informed of the importance of advances in their own individual areas. So I had a pretty good idea of what might be done if we put it all together. First, though, there were other interests that had to be dealt with. Then, in late 1980, the government asserted its right and zeroed out the budget for Argonne's principal reactor, EBR-2. Argonne's entire R&D program, 40% of the lab, was threatened. All the facilities and staff that had been painstakingly built up over the years were now at risk. Something had to be done. A few weeks later, I was appointed associate laboratory director in charge of it all. The lab director told me later he had again consulted with that good man Hans Bethe at Cornell on an external candidate and been told by Bethe that he had the right man in the laboratory already. Grateful as I was to Professor Bethe for his confidence, this looked like no easy assignment. However, and I'm sure at risk to himself, the lab director was explicit in giving me a completely free hand in dealing with the problem. So now I was in charge of a dozen or so divisions made up of about 2,000 scientists, engineers, and supporting staff. I couldn't let the reactor be shut down. It was at the center of everything I wanted to accomplish. So, Mr. Minister, in this situation, politics had to be brought into play. Argonne's big reactor test site, as you know, was in the Idaho desert, and Idaho had a powerful Republican senator in Jim McClure. I called out to Idaho on my first day to find the most politically active Republican we had on staff out there. I found exactly the right man. His wife had been McClure's chief of staff. So we spent an afternoon with Jim McClure on my problem and on nuclear affairs in Idaho generally, and left with his dry comment. The last bullet has not been fired on this one. And a week or so later, I was solemnly notified by the Department of Energy that all funding had been restored. My problem had gone away. With the budget now stabilized, I could turn back to program. I'd felt for some time that a sharply different direction in breeder R&D was needed. I wanted to see how far we could go in allaying the concerns that my colleagues, anti-nuclear colleagues, had said they had with nuclear. There'd been very real advances and discoveries in the Argonne program in the previous decade, and there were several islands of true excellence within the program, but there was nothing in the way of a coherent program with a specific goal, and I needed to change that. I needed an opportunity. The Department of Energy was still trying to get the Clinch River breeder reactor built. This was a reactor based on 1960s technology that was taking forever to build. But I knew there was no sense in trying to compete with it. But then in November of 1983, Congress canceled that big project, and there was the opportunity. Our aim was to be simple. I wanted to develop the best reactor system ever. I'd been in charge of the Argonne reactor development program for some years by then. I knew the risk to the lab. I knew a development program of the kind I was contemplating could run up to about $2 billion and take 10 years. 10 years or so was probably a pretty good guess as to the time that would be needed to get everything worth doing done. And this was not an initiative that would be welcomed by anyone, not by the Department of Energy, who would be by no means pleased that the lab was pushing them in new directions, not by the nuclear industry, who had their hands full trying to inch forward with present reactor systems, and of course not by the organized nuclear opposition. Actually, they didn't give us much trouble in the early going because they thought we had no chance of success anyway. I made it a point to get to know our congressional delegations in Illinois, where our main lab was. And in Illinois, as I mentioned, I did quite a bit of good work for the two Idaho senators and the congressman. I'd been introduced around to other delegations by our delegations, and I had a number of friends by now in them, so I felt I had enough to begin. The University of Chicago, of course, holds the contract for Argonne, and I was invited to brief a meeting of the Board of Governors of that fine university on new initiatives. Here was the opportunity made real. It would be a gamble, but the time was now. I needed a name for the new reactor system, and while driving to work that morning, I decided to refer to it as the Integral Fast Reactor. It was neutral sounding. It shouldn't offend anyone. So I felt, well, it could be changed later. The name didn't get changed, of course. It stuck. And as a name for a reactor project, as Mark Twain once said about the music of Richard Wagner, it's not as bad as it sounds. The board approved my undertaking, and through one of the board members, I was invited to meet with the president's science advisor, a gentleman named Jay Keyworth. I knew the stakes. This man had the power to implement what I wanted to do. All I wanted was a start, a charter to start work. I knew what to do after that. Initiate, to begin with, only the most important elements of the proposed program. brief congressional hearings, seek interviews, publicity, and so on. And I needed to begin drawing together the best of our people into this one big program, focused on a single goal: to develop, again, the best fast reactor system ever. After a long afternoon with Keyworth, I was promised $2 million. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and it gave me, I won't call it legal, it gave me a proper charter to actually start work on this new project. Now, to grow and maintain a program of that magnitude, 3 things are needed. Sound science, of course, and I felt we had that. Second, enthusiastic support from the scientific elite of the field, again, the older men. That's critical to credibility. That I needed to generate. And finally, based on that credibility, solid congressional support. So one by one, I visited the nuclear statesmen whose support I needed. Hans Bethe, again, was first. Manson Benedict, again, founding chairman of the Nuclear Engineering Department at MIT, was next in line, and Lombard Squires, the ex-head of the huge reprocessing installations operated by DuPont in South Carolina, and several others of similar credentials. In a month, I had an advisory committee with absolutely unimpeachable credentials. One DOA couldn't begin to match and didn't try, after some grumbling. These men's judgments were respected everywhere, and they knew the game, of course. Their annual report always found its way to key congressional staff every year. Then, early in April, came a huge step forward, April of 1986. We were now ready to demonstrate the new safety characteristics of the newly developed IFR fuel on EBR-2. One by one, we initiated the most serious accidents that can befall a nuclear reactor. In the morning, we did Chernobyl. The reactor simply shut itself down under the same conditions that the world had seen at Chernobyl. No damage. The control systems hadn't had to work. The safety systems were all disabled. We shut off the power to the pumps just like the people in Russia did. The trace went like this, the power trace, we were at full power. The trace went up like this. And an amusing thing, we Argonne people were standing at the back there, and we had invited the international audience. And when the power trace started to go up like that, straight up, these heads in front of me that were just shadows, because there was a big TV screen behind that, went bobbing up like this, flipped around to see whether the Argonne people were running yet. And the fact was, no, we weren't. The trace went up like this, turned around, came down, and just out evenly. Reactor was shut down, still critical, but with only shutdown heat, and an absolutely astonishing demonstration, I thought. Then in the afternoon, we did the 3 Mile Island accident, where we cut off, again at full power, all cooling to the reactor, which is a disaster as we saw it 3 Mile Island. With the IFR, again, the reactor, this time there was no power overshoot, it just went down. And again, the reactor was down at shutdown heat power levels. No damage of any kind. Really a remarkable demonstration. Everything that the reactor did was simply due to the materials that the reactor was made of. And that's the important point. We had, as I said, a rather large international audience watching this. DOE issued a press release. Nobody paid the slightest attention. But then, later that month of April 1986, one of the two accidents that we had initiated actually happened. And it happened on the world stage with riveting TV coverage 24 hours a day and the greatest possible concern, and rightly so, at Chernobyl. A science reporter at the Wall Street Journal, Jerry Bishop by name, made the connection. A catastrophic event in the Soviet case, no harmful effect at all on the reactor in Idaho. Both had had the same accident initiation conditions. The press release on the EBR-2 test had been lying on his desk. Now, I said to a number of others, I'm quite often I'm the luckiest guy in the world. What timing? I'll go on. He reached me in a phone booth in West Yellowstone and kept me there while he wrote a piece for the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And that article caused an immediate sensation in the right committees of Congress. It was timed perfectly. I was invited repeatedly to testify. The increases in funding that followed put people to work on every aspect of the IFR now. The budget was liberal, and we were really on our way. For 10 years, the work went on. Always I testified in front of the relevant congressional committees. The members get to know you, of course, and they angle their questions accordingly. Always the congressional votes were close, but by the early 90s, we'd proven most of the elements of the new technology, and we'd proven the safety, we'd proven the new fuel processing technique, which was based, by the way, on electrorefining. And the nuclear waste forms, the final forms for the waste were also well along. But now it came 1994. The new Clinton administration had been in power then for a year and a half. And it was filled with the same gentlemen that I had traveled with, the anti-nukes who I knew well. And now they were in positions of power. And they went all out to kill our program. I testified, as I said, in front of all the committees again. And in the end, after a long session, the Senate voted to maintain our program, a moment of relief. But the House voted with the wishes of the President, not unsurprisingly. And in conference committee, behind closed doors, the administration position held, such as politics, our program was gone. The best development program, I believe, ever in the world, and it was gone. Now, first-rate development work generates a real sense of urgency. That's, a lot of you older men in the audience know this. It's not just desirable, it's necessary. With urgency comes visible progress. Progress across the board, and people take pride in their own progress and that of the team. They can see the importance of their work. It's right there in front of them. They're making history. There's no feeling quite like it. but now it was over. 10 years of tumult and excitement for those of us shepherding the program. 10 years of wonderful accomplishment for the technical people. A lot that hadn't been known was now established fact. A new technology was possible that can improve every facet of nuclear power. And the technology of the integral fast reactor, the technology of the IFR exists. It is fact. We know its design, we know how to build it, and we know how to operate it. But in the US, at least, it's not going ahead. Not yet. I'm going to quote you again, another of Churchill's humorous comments. Americans, he said, always do the right thing after the other possibilities have been exhausted. And that's what's needed here, I think. All the other possibilities have to be exhausted before nuclear power will make a significant step ahead. But IFR technology will be needed. It will come. But now, again, a powerful sentence written by George MacDonald Fraser in a far different context summarizes the work of the people who for 10 years succeeded so brilliantly. And it summarizes my feelings exactly. We did what we did, and it was worth doing. And no one could have done it better or half as well. So I come to the end. That's my story. A story that goes back to the kind of things a good engineering college can give. An engineering education that demands quality work and builds confidence. The two things necessary for real accomplishment. It's a story that shows the importance of association with experienced, first-rate engineers and scientists, with the older men, and Russell quotes, Russell Long's quote early in my story, that I was privileged to have in my own career. Those people, the professors at the University of Saskatchewan, College of Engineering, Geo Handegord, Balford Curry, head of the physics department, showed me the kind of career and the kind of life these things made possible. And more, they made it possible for me. And in the end, as my story illustrates, it is often the help of just the right person at just the right time that makes such possibilities real. Thank you very much, everyone. You thought you'd got rid of me, didn't you?
No. Just a vote of thanks to the speaker. Just want to point out that MacKenzie galas are celebrations. And I would like to say it's more than a celebration. It is celebrating the past, nurturing the present, and inspiring the future. And when we were asked to find a speaker for this event, a privilege for the physics and engineering physics department, we got on to work last spring, and we were pouring through the biographies of people. And when we hit the Charles Tell, we knew we didn't have to look any further. Only question we had was, would Dr. Charles Tell accept our invitation? That's one thing. Second question was, even if he accepts, would he be willing to come to Saskatoon in January instead of going to Nevada, his winter home? And we are very, very thankful that he accepted. Dr. Ernie Barber was the dean at the time. He made a phone call and he accepted, and we are thrilled that he accepted to come here and then give the talk. And then today, as you saw, as you heard from his talk, it is an illustrious career, and a career which talks about the education, value of education that he got coming from a small town in Saskatchewan at the University of Saskatchewan. I think one of the things which we like to, all of us to take away from this one is, like he said a few times, work hard, be confident. These are the two characteristics if you develop and work towards it. Saskatchewan is not a hindrance for you. It could be an advantage for you, an asset for you. And what Dr. Till has done, even though his project was scrapped by the American government, the ideas, the things that they have done in terms of the recycling, the fuel ideas, and managing the waste ideas, these are the ideas now being taken up by the Gen 4 reactors, which are going to become online in 10, 20 years from now onwards. So Dr. Till, your work and your colleagues' work was not a waste, and your talk was very inspirational. We would like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sherry. And thank you very much.
And a small Just a few more words of thank you to the people who should be recognized here. And MacKenzie Gala got started in one form or other back in 1976, as was called as Alumni Distinguished Alumnus Seminar. And it was started by two professors at the time. One was Mel Hussein, who is here today, and the other one was Chobodiak. And without that initiative that they have started a small activity, we would not be celebrating this big activity of 38. So I would really like to thank Dr. Mel Hussein, who is here today. Please join me in applauding him for that. An event of this kind really takes lots of people, lots of supporters, lots of sponsors. And the industry, business, and the government, and the administrators, all of you have been very supportive of this. The fact that we could fill all this place here was nothing but your work, because of your contribution, because of your support, because of your interest. And we hope that this activity, this interest will continue in the future years. And basically, I also want to thank the student participants indeed. Student participants recognize that this kind of activity is meant for you. It is trying to motivate you, and it is trying to take away something from this kind of symposia and activities. Please recognize that. And last but not the least, if I have to identify one single person who made all these things possible, I worked pretty much, very consistently, very actively, with a smiling on her face. It will be Shana Jardin. And you may have met her, and she has done a wonderful job, and we could have done without her. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good night.
Well, with following a lecture that I think can only be described as spellbinding, riveting, I think even if you're not a physicist, you would agree that was quite a story that Dr. Till told us. And Dr. Rangacharyulu's closing words, I'd like to thank you all for coming, thank our dignitaries, President Bush-Vishniak, Councillor Lowen, who had to leave a bit early, Dean Kiparos, and our various colleagues, and of course Minister Norris, who we were delighted to have attend. So thank you all. Thanks to all the students, all the volunteers, Shauna Jardine especially. So thanks again.